It is great to see all of you this morning, and I truly mean that. I mean that every time I say that. But on a morning like today, before service, we were talking in this chat about the danger that has faced our community in the past 24, 48 hours. And we truly are grateful that people are safe. Property may not be safe, but people are safe, and we're grateful. And then to hear that last song, "It Is Well With My Soul." It was just a declaration of yes, we acknowledge that and we're grateful. Have you ever felt as if you were in over your head? And if you are, or if you have felt that way, did you just roll with it and hope that everyone would be okay with that, or maybe that they wouldn't notice? I have to admit that when I read biblical texts like what Eileen just read for us, I sometimes wonder if Paul was in over his head. And he never let on. He just rolled with that. There's a lot that is contained in those 7 verses that she read. A lot that went before that, a lot that came after that. But here in this time and place, we find Paul in one of the most prestigious places in Athens at that time, surrounded by people who loved nothing more than to spend all of their time talking about the latest ideas and philosophies. And I'm not sure we know what that's like, because a lot of us actually have work we need to do. But imagine a comparable place or comparable places and topics of conversation today. And I have to thank a couple of my good millennial friends for giving me a little bit of insight into what that might be today. The modern day equivalent could be discussing things like cancel culture, or maximalist approaches to issues, or extremism, or the debilitating burden of student loan debt at local bars or coffee shops. It could be similar to discussing authentic Christianity, being in tune with yourself, with the earth, practicing self-care to avoid the inevitable burnout that comes to so many, discussing those on college campuses when they're in session in person. Or comparing notes on social media about how to be taken seriously in a dominant culture that still values possessions and status, when it's becoming more and more important to have experiences rather than owning things. And just this morning, I got another text to this idea, and this is what I love about communicating with millennials. It's just this ongoing conversation of having ideas, so it fits really well. They talked about this whole dynamic of idols that surrounded this place, this Areopagus. It wasn't in our text, but Paul had just come from there. So what would be some of those today? Possibly things like money, or violence, power, sexuality or gender, sports. And some of the places that these are discussed is everywhere from corporate boardrooms to Wall Street to Main Street to tailgate parties, even at gun shows, award shows, even in Washington and Hollywood. Okay. If you don't know what all of those terms that I mentioned in the last paragraph mean, don't worry about it. As I mentioned, I think Paul didn't know everything about the latest philosophies either when he came to Athens, but he engaged, and he learned, and he discussed. So before you know it, Paul is taken to speak before the council of this Areopagus, or Mars Hill as it is later called by the Romans. So this word Areopagus simply is a composite of the Greek name Areopagus, translated the Aris rock, meaning it was the highest elevation of that region behind the city of Athens. Before the 5th century BCE, the Areopagus was the council of the elders of the city, very much like the Roman Senate was later on. Functioned as the high court of appeals for criminal and civil cases. So I suppose the attorneys were there. It was always an institution of rule or law in ancient Greece, and it is from here that Paul is said to have given this famous speech. The Areopagus has been associated with the spread of the Christian faith into Greece after Paul made a compelling public appeal to the Athenians to consider an unknown God whom he had come to love and to trust. It's my impression that Paul took on anyone. Prior to coming to Athens, he had been in a neighboring city, dialoguing with both Jews and Greeks who gathered to worship together in a Jewish synagogue. Now that religious institution was home territory for Paul. But the Jews became jealous, and they whipped agitators into a frenzy to oppose Paul and his colleague Silas, essentially driving them out of town with this statement: "These people who have been disturbing the peace throughout the empire have also come here." So that's the part Erebus and Rossi were talking about. They were no longer welcome. These disruptors of the empire moved along to the next town, to Berea. And when these agitators followed them to Berea, Paul simply moved on to Athens. Silas went his way. So Paul was bullied by the religious folk of that city. And then he landed in a city where people love to talk about the latest thing, the latest philosophies, ideas. So it's fascinating to observe how adept Paul was at changing his messaging. Notice I didn't say changing his message. He changed his messaging. There's a significant difference. Messaging has to do with approach and expression, and message is content, which can remain more or less stable over time. In a matter of days then, Paul moved from being bullied by the religious folks to being a novelty in an environment where they even had a place to honor the unknown God. How does Paul approach people who are unfamiliar with the God he has come to love and trust? What does he choose to highlight? He mentions God doesn't live in sanctuaries made by human hands. He says God is a giver, a divine force who gives life, breath, everything. And he says God is near. In fact, God is the one in whom we live and move and have our being. I found it interesting that these are the issues that he sees as foundational to talk with these people who are not familiar with this God that he's presenting. So let's look at these three. Though Paul said God doesn't live in sanctuaries, people continue to regard dwellings for God or places to worship God as some of the most critical elements of our faith. Think back to our spiritual tradition, beginning with our Judaistic foundation. The people of Israel built a tabernacle, then a temple, then synagogues. Those who follow Jesus now build churches and sometimes expansive places of worship. People of other faiths do the same. Can you count the number of places of worship simply in this relatively small city that we live in? Yet Jesus had told the woman he met at the well in Samaria that rather than location or building being primary, spirit and truth is. That may strike us as being rather mystical, and the Western mind struggles with things that are too intangible. But early believers met in homes and had everything in common. That changed quite quickly when it became politically advantageous to organize and institutionalize. Native people in our country understood the value of spirit and truth and ritual, but we seem to have forgotten. Those who came to this land under the mantle of the doctrine of discovery drove this intuitive worship of God from people by force. Those who somehow managed to survive and maintain their rituals and ways of the spirit were also seen as disruptors of the empire that has just invaded this land. This indigenous form of worship was seen as something that needed to be squelched and eliminated. God doesn't live in sanctuaries built by humans is a theological statement, and a revolutionary one at that. One that seems to be at least part of what earned Paul the accusation of being a disruptor of the empire. The connection between religious institution, structure, and empire has always been an unholy alliance. This is one of the points that Paul feels compelled to make as he interacts with these people unfamiliar with this unknown God. Paul also makes the case for God being a giver. This claim was made in a time when the Greeks believed in a plethora of gods who needed to be appeased. These deities were capricious and unpredictable, often fighting amongst themselves and acting much like spoiled humans throwing tantrums. If anything, a deity wanted offerings and gifts, but was not known to give for the sake of love or generosity. Maybe in response to human obedience, sacrifice, and devotion. So to claim that God was the originator of life and is the giver of everything would seem ludicrous to the modern educated ears of that day. And yet Paul claims from one person, God created every human nation to live on the whole earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their lands. That's verse 24. The Message paraphrase words it a little more understandably. Starting from scratch, God made the entire human race and made the earth hospitable, with plenty of time and space for living so that we could seek after God. The divine is a force so profound that it creates life, time, space. This divine gift takes place each time a cell divides, a wound heals, a sprout germinates, or a new universe is born in a black hole, if that is in fact what happens. God is the originating energy that birthed humanity, the abundance and sustainability of the earth, ample time and space to carve out a fulfilling existence, so much so that we can seek after God. I grew up knowing the words of verse 28 very well, as it was a favorite of my mother's. In God we live and move and have our being. I really regret never asking her what exactly that meant to her. She was this tiny, under 100-pound, very fragile person who lived to be almost 91. But Paul felt it was important enough to include this message, God is near, in this speech that day to the wise, prestigious ones in Athens. He made the case that God's presence and gifts of life, breath, and sustainable planet and wide expanses of time and space were offered for a purpose. For humanity to realize God is not far from any of us. In fact, our life, our movement, our being cannot be extracted from the divine. Think about that. Like water droplets in an ocean. It's like chlorophyll in the veins of a leaf, or like oxygen filling our lungs and then entering our blood cells. This is oneness. This is what it means to live, move, have our being in God. This is what it means to be God's children. This movement, this motion, this presence. Paul invited his hearers into that. We are invited in as well. It's remarkable that Paul chose these three pillars to present that day. And though we're removed from that time by thousands of years, we're still humans seeking after God. God is still giving abundantly. We observe this every time we watch a child, are stunned by a beautiful sunset, marvel at people's resiliency in excruciating times. God still has a vested interest in our planet, in us, inviting all of creation to live, move, have our being together within this divine dance. And in that sense, what Paul focused on back then is remarkably timeless and relevant. As we consider where we meet God, let's never forget that it is neither the simple structures nor the opulent edifices that are the essence of our faith. Paul's words are a reminder to resist investing more in physical structures, in institutions, things, tangible housing for the presence of God, since this focus can so easily become all-encompassing. A preoccupation with sanctuary will inevitably shift our focus away from spirit and truth. When we feel this time of pandemic, economic quaking, political chaos has drained the last drop of energy from us, dried up all our creativity, replaced hope with anger, robbed us of sleep, vision, time, aged us by 10 years. Remember the giver, the extravagant giver of a diverse and vibrant humanity, breath, life, a place on this beautiful earth. Enough time for us to seek after God. I confess it feels as if life has been marred. Beauty has become splintered. We groan with our planet in its distress. We feel weighed down under the demands of our time. And this is not the first time. But I invite you, just as I remind myself, to remember the giver, the one in whom we live, we move, we have our being. Even in our isolation, when we would give anything to end the loneliness, when events around and feelings within us pile up kind of like a heap of trash. Remember, we are as near to God as the air we breathe. God's movement, breath, and life are ours. Allow that to sink into your soul and bring about a new expansiveness of experience and understanding and feeling. These three pillars do not bully, but they do disrupt. The ways of the Spirit are not controllable. The Spirit cannot be easily monetized. Worshiping in spirit and truth is subversive and threatening. Are we ready for this? Ready to talk about what represents our modern day Areopagus? Those bars, conference halls, coffee shops, social platforms, corporate boardrooms, classrooms, and how to adjust the messaging, not the message, the messaging, so it will be relevant for people concerned about justice, extremism, the load of student debt, cancel culture, exhibiting a faith that reflects Jesus. As was the case with Paul, if you read on in the chapter, there will be those with whom this message will resonate. Others will reject it as irrelevant and incoherent. But spirit and truth will disrupt the empire. Amen.